Welcome to Mr. Kelin Stories. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm so excited you're here today. If you love heartwarming stories filled with unexpected twists, suspense, and life-changing lessons, then you're in the right place. Today, we've got a story you won't believe about a poor girl who scratched a millionaire's car, and what happened next will leave you shocked. You don't want to miss this one. Before we dive in, please take a moment to subscribe, comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear your reactions. And don't forget to share this story with your friends if you think they need a little inspiration today. I pray for your happiness and success, and I hope you find something in today's story that inspires you to keep pushing forward no matter where life takes you. Let's get into it. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in a bustling city, a city where the world seemed to be divided by an invisible line, one that separated the wealthy from the struggling. Sarah, a 17-year-old girl, walked quickly through the crowded streets. Her shoes were old and worn, the soles barely holding up as she made her way to her part-time job at a diner. She could feel the cold breeze against her cheeks, the kind of wind that made you want to curl up under a blanket and forget about the world for just a moment. But there was no time for rest. She had dreams of a better life, dreams of escaping her situation and making something of herself. But dreams often felt like distant stars, just out of reach, no matter how hard you tried. Still, she worked tirelessly at the diner every night, scraping together just enough to pay for her mother's medication and cover the rent for their small apartment. As she walked along the busy street, her mind was lost in thoughts of her mother and the endless challenges that awaited her at work. The noise of car horns and chatter echoed in the background, but Sarah wasn't paying attention. She didn't see the luxury car parked right in front of her, its glossy black exterior reflecting the sunlight. In the blink of an eye, her shoulder brushed against the car as she tried to sidestep a passerby. The collision was slight, but it was enough to leave a long, deep scratch along the sleek surface of the vehicle. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. The scratch wasn't just a little mark, it was a scar on something precious, something that probably cost more than she would ever earn in a year. She took a step back, looking at the damage with wide eyes. She didn't know what to do. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense up. Her first instinct was to run, to disappear into the crowd, but she couldn't. She turned slowly, her stomach twisting in knots, only to come face to face with the owner of the car. He was tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, the kind of suit you only saw in movies or on the covers of business magazines. He had an air of confidence, and his dark, intense eyes locked onto hers. Sarah felt small under his gaze. His jaw tightened as his eyes moved from the scratch to her face. For a moment, everything stood still. The world was so loud, but in that instant, it was silent. Her heart pounded in her chest as the man took a step closer. She felt the weight of the situation press down on her like a heavy boulder. How was she going to fix this? What would he do? She wasn't some rich girl who could just wave her hand and make it go away. She was just Sarah, a girl who worked hard for every penny and barely had enough to get by. "Hey," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Did you scratch my car?" His question was like a cold splash of water on her face. The words felt like an accusation, and Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to apologize, to make it right, but how could she? I'm sorry," she stammered, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. I don't have the money to fix it." The man's gaze softened slightly, but the tension in the air still hung heavy. He didn't immediately shout, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he just stood there, looking at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through her. It was as if he was trying to decide what to do with her, whether she was a problem to solve or just an unfortunate mistake in the grand scheme of things. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Her mind raced. What if he called the police? What if he demanded she pay for the repairs? She couldn't afford any of it. She would lose everything. But then something strange happened. The man didn't shout, didn't demand anything. He just looked at her. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was almost as if he knew something about her that no one else did. He didn't judge her like the others might. Instead, he stepped back slightly, his expression softening just enough to make her feel like she wasn't facing a monster, but someone who might understand what it was like to be in her shoes. She stood there, unsure of what to say, her hands trembling as she clutched the strap of her bag tighter. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the man seemed to contemplate his next move. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely breathe, waiting for his reaction. And then, just when she thought the silence might swallow her whole, the man spoke again. "I'm not going to make a scene," he said, his voice gentler now. "But you need to be more careful next time." The words hit her like a wave of relief, but they were also a reminder that this was far from over. She had made a mistake, and she knew she couldn't just walk away without facing some consequence. But in that moment, for reasons she couldn't understand, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe not all rich people were the same. Maybe there was still a chance for kindness, even in a world that often seemed cold and indifferent. Just as Sarah began to turn away, hoping to slip into the crowd unnoticed, the weight of her guilt still heavy in her chest, the sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze in place. The distinct rhythm of shoes on pavement grew louder, and before she could react, a tall figure appeared in front of her. Her stomach clenched as she instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. A man, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, stood there, his gaze fixed firmly on the car. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident air that was hard to miss. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his shoes were so polished they seemed to gleam in the afternoon sun. The sharp cut of his suit made it clear that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. His presence alone demanded respect. He glanced around briefly, almost as if checking if anyone else was witnessing what had just happened, and then his eyes landed on the scratch. In that moment, Sarah felt like the whole world had stopped spinning. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched. She could see the anger building, but also something else, an intense, scrutinizing gaze that seemed to search her very soul. His voice cut through the silence like a knife, calm but laced with a hint of fury. "Hey!" he called, his tone cool but firm, the type of voice you'd expect from someone who had no patience for nonsense. He took a few slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between them. "Did you scratch my car?" The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, as if he was already passing judgment. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a split second she forgot how to speak. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. With a shaky breath, she managed to stammer out, I'm so sorry. It was an accident." Her voice was barely audible, swallowed up by the thick tension in the air. "I didn't mean to. Please, I don't have the money to fix it." Her words felt feeble, inadequate. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but the words caught in her throat, leaving her feeling small and powerless. She felt like a child caught stealing, her whole existence reduced to the awkward, uncomfortable moment unfolding before her. The man, who hadn't moved an inch since he arrived, didn't seem to soften. Instead, he just stood there, sizing her up. His eyes moved slowly over her, from her messy hair to her worn clothes, and then back to her face. There was something in his gaze, a sense of calculation, a quiet scrutiny. He wasn't angry anymore, but there was a coldness in his expression that made Sarah feel even more exposed. His eyes locked with hers for a moment longer, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a heavy pressure on her chest. And then, as if finally coming to a decision, he spoke again. His tone was cool, almost detached. "I'm Alex Parker," he said, as if his name alone should explain everything. The way he said it, so effortlessly, with such confidence, made Sarah feel like she was standing in front of someone who carried the world on his shoulders. She had no idea who he was, but the way he said his name made it clear that it carried weight. He wasn't just any man. He was someone important, someone who could have her life turned upside down with a simple flick of his wrist. "You should have been more careful," Alex continued, his voice now tinged with a note of frustration. "This car isn't cheap, you know." He gestured to the car with a wave of his hand, as if it were an extension of himself, something so valuable that the mere thought of it being damaged was almost unforgivable. Sarah's heart sank even further. She had already known that the car was expensive, the sleek black exterior, the gleaming chrome accents. It screamed wealth. But now, with his words hanging in the air, it felt like her worst fears were coming true. This wasn't just a regular car, it was a symbol of everything she didn't have, everything she couldn't reach. It was the kind of car people dreamt of, but could never afford. And she had scratched it. She, someone who barely had enough money to buy lunch. The pressure in her chest tightened. She felt humiliated, exposed, as if she were being judged by the whole city. The shame weighed her down, and for a moment it felt like the whole world was watching her every move. But despite the overwhelming shame, something inside her couldn't help but speak up. What are you going to do to me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She regretted the words as soon as they left her lips, but they had slipped out, a mix of fear and uncertainty that she couldn't control. Alex tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. For a moment, Sarah thought he would snap at her, tell her that she would have to pay for the damage or face some kind of punishment, but instead he stood there silently, his expression unreadable. Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what to expect. Was he going to call the police? Was he going to demand money she didn't have? Would he humiliate her further in front of anyone who might be watching? Her thoughts spiraled, her pulse quickening with each passing second. But then, unexpectedly, Alex broke the silence. He exhaled slowly, his expression shifting from frustration to something else, almost a sense of resignation. "Look, I'm not going to make a scene," he said, his tone softer than before. "It's just a scratch. People make mistakes." Sarah blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. She had been bracing herself for the worst, but what he said didn't make sense. You're not mad?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Alex's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Of course I'm annoyed, but it's just a car." His voice was calm, unruffled. "Things can be fixed. People can't." For a moment, Sarah didn't know how to respond. His words didn't match her expectations. She had anticipated anger, blame, maybe even threats. But instead, he was understanding. She could hardly believe it. The man who stood before her wasn't the person she had imagined. He wasn't some cold, entitled millionaire who would snap at her for a minor mistake. No, there was something different about him, a depth, a calmness that made her question everything she thought she knew about people like him. "I'm not going to call the police," Alex added, breaking her thoughts, "but you need to be more careful. This car means a lot to me, and I don't take carelessness lightly. But I don't think you meant to do this, so I'll let it go." Sarah was taken aback by his response. She had expected anything but this. Her mind raced, trying to understand why he wasn't reacting like everyone else she had encountered, people who saw her as nothing more than a poor girl with no worth. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief flood through her. Sarah stood frozen, waiting for Alex to make his next move. She had braced herself for the worst. Maybe he would demand she pay for the damage, or worse, call the police. She could already hear the sirens in her mind, and the fear of being arrested gnawed at her insides. She had nothing to her name, no money to pay for the scratch, and the very thought of facing any legal trouble made her want to disappear. But instead of doing any of those things, Alex simply stood there, his eyes still locked on hers. His face was unreadable, the calmness of his expression unsettling. The silence between them stretched on, thick with the weight of unspoken words. It was like he was waiting for something, but Sarah didn't know what. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her heart thudded in her chest. She could feel the tension mounting, like the moment before a storm broke. And then, just when she thought she couldn't stand the silence any longer, Alex spoke. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady, without any hint of anger or accusation. It wasn't a command, but more of a suggestion, one that felt oddly inviting. Sarah blinked, utterly confused. She thought she had misheard him. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling. She had expected him to get angry or demand something, but this was completely out of left field. "Come with me," Alex repeated, his gaze unwavering. "I'll show you how to fix it." For a brief moment, Sarah was too stunned to respond. Her brain couldn't process what he was saying. Fix it? How could she possibly fix something like this? She wasn't a mechanic. She was a waitress, struggling to make ends meet. What did he mean? Was he going to take her to a body shop and demand she work off the debt somehow? Or was this some sort of trick? Her mind raced, and doubt flooded her thoughts. Was he trying to trap her? Would he have her do something crazy, or make her pay in ways she couldn't imagine? 1,000 worst-case scenarios spun in her head. She opened her mouth to protest, but Alex's calm, almost soothing demeanor stopped her. There was no aggression in his voice, no signs of malice. It was as if he wasn't looking to punish her, but rather to help. Something in his steady, unwavering gaze made her pause, made her hesitate for a moment. Her gut told her to run. It told her that following him could only end badly. After all, who in their right mind would just forgive a scratch on their expensive car without asking for something in return? But something deeper inside her, something she hadn't listened to in a long time, urged her to trust him, at least for this moment. "Why are you helping me?" she finally blurted out, the words escaping her before she could stop them. She didn't understand. What was his game? Alex didn't immediately answer. Instead, he just looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. His lips parted, but it wasn't as if he was going to explain himself. He didn't need to. It was clear to Sarah that his actions were speaking louder than any words he could offer. "I'm not trying to make you feel worse," he said quietly. "It's just a scratch. It can be fixed. I know you didn't mean to do it, but if you really want to make things right, let me show you how to fix it. We all make mistakes. The important part is how we handle them afterward." The simplicity of his words hit Sarah like a wave. Her eyes widened, her chest tightening with a mix of confusion and relief. He wasn't looking to punish her. He wasn't trying to extract something from her. He genuinely seemed to want to help. A flicker of hope began to spark in her chest, though it was still clouded by her uncertainty. She had never experienced kindness like this from someone who clearly had wealth and power. She was used to people seeing her as nothing more than a poor girl, someone who didn't matter. And yet, here was Alex Parker, someone who could easily have taken her to court or called the police, offering to help her instead. Despite her fear, despite every ounce of her instinct telling her to be careful, Sarah found herself nodding. Something about the way he spoke, the kindness in his voice, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he was different. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come with you." Alex gave a small nod, as if he had expected this answer all along. Without another word, he turned and started walking towards the sidewalk, his strides long and confident. Sarah hesitated for a second, glancing at the shiny black car that still seemed to loom over her. The scratch she had caused, so small in the grand scheme of things, yet so large in her mind, reminded her of the vast divide between her world and his. But then she took a deep breath and followed him. She wasn't sure what she was walking into, but she couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. Maybe this wouldn't end badly. Maybe it was just a chance to learn, to do something she had never done before. And even if she couldn't fix the car, maybe she could learn something that could help her in the future. As they walked together, the city around them seemed to fade away. The noise of traffic, the people rushing past, all of it seemed distant and unimportant. Sarah's focus was entirely on Alex, as he led her down a side street toward a small auto repair shop that she had passed by 100 times but never noticed. It was tucked between two larger buildings, almost hidden in plain sight. The sign above the door was faded and worn, but the shop itself had an old, comforting charm. The smell of oil and rubber filled the air as they entered, and the clang of tools against metal echoed from inside. Alex led Sarah past a few cars in various stages of repair, his stride confident as he approached the owner of the shop, a middle-aged man with a gruff but friendly face. "Joe, I need your help," Alex said, his tone casual, as if he were asking for something simple. Joe looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw Alex, he nodded. "No problem, Alex. What do you need?" "Just a quick fix. I've got a little scratch to deal with," Alex explained, turning toward Sarah. "This is Sarah. She's going to help me out." Sarah blinked, her mind reeling. She was supposed to help fix the car. She knew nothing about auto repairs. She had never even picked up a wrench in her life. But there was something in Alex's easygoing demeanor that made her want to at least try. Maybe this wasn't just about fixing the car. Maybe this was about teaching her something, giving her a chance to learn how to take control of a situation, even when it felt impossible. "Don't worry," Alex said with a smile, sensing her hesitation. "I'll walk you through it." With that, he led her over to the car, and Sarah's heart began to race again. What had she gotten herself into? But as Alex explained what needed to be done and showed her how to carefully buff out the scratch, something began to change inside her. The fear, the uncertainty, slowly began to fade away. Maybe this wasn't as difficult as it seemed. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. As they stepped into the repair shop, the scent of motor oil and rust filled the air. The sounds of metal clanging and tools being dropped echoed in the back. A steady rhythm of work. Sarah followed Alex, her eyes taking in the worn-out shelves filled with car parts, the grease-streaked walls, and the mechanic hunched over a car engine, his face covered in a layer of dirt. It was a world so different from the polished high-end offices or the gleaming showrooms she imagined wealthy people frequented. Alex walked with ease into this humble, no-frills space. He didn't look out of place, and Sarah couldn't help but feel like she had been transported into another world. A world where people, no matter how much money they had, worked with their hands and cared about the things that really mattered. As they walked past the cars in various stages of repair, Alex turned to Sarah, his tone easy, almost casual. "This car is just a thing," he said, almost with a shrug, as though it were a small, insignificant detail. "I've worked hard for everything I have, but I also know that material things don't define who you are. People do." Sarah froze for a moment, her feet stopping mid-step. His words hit her like a wave, washing over the hard-held assumptions she had about people like him. Her entire life, she had been taught that the wealthy were cold, selfish, and detached from the struggles of the rest of the world. They lived in their bubble, untouched by the reality of everyday people. Rich people didn't care about anything beyond their own desires. They were out of touch with what it meant to struggle, to sacrifice. They were the ones who looked at her, someone who worked tirelessly just to make ends meet and didn't see her as anything more than a passing face in the crowd. But Alex was different. The words he spoke were so simple, so unassuming, and yet they shattered everything she had believed. He wasn't just some arrogant billionaire who flaunted his wealth. He was grounded, thoughtful, and, most surprisingly, humble. Sarah swallowed hard. There was a small, tight knot in her chest. She hadn't realized how deeply she had internalized the idea that money changed people, made them less human, more distant from the realities of the world. But Alex was challenging that. His calm demeanor, the way he spoke without pretense, made her question everything she had known about people like him. They walked deeper into the shop, and as they did, Sarah's eyes kept drifting back to Alex. She watched him as he chatted with the mechanic, a man who looked as though he had spent his entire life under the hood of a car. Alex asked questions about the work being done, showing genuine interest. He didn't talk down to the mechanic or make him feel like a subordinate. Instead, he listened carefully and offered advice when needed, as though the mechanic's expertise truly mattered to him. Sarah watched this with a growing sense of awe. The man she had imagined, someone who looked at people like her with disdain, was not the man standing before her now. Alex didn't seem like the entitled, arrogant figure she had pictured. Instead, he was approachable, thoughtful, and most of all, genuine. He wasn't interested in flaunting his success or making others feel inferior. In fact, everything about his manner, his calm, his humility, was a stark contrast to the wealth he represented. She had expected him to act differently, perhaps to dismiss her, to brush her off as an insignificant part of his day. But here he was, treating everyone with respect, regardless of their status. The truth was, she was starting to feel like maybe she had misjudged him, maybe she had misjudged all people like him. Her heart shifted. The knot in her chest loosened just a bit. Perhaps Alex wasn't so different from her after all. Maybe it wasn't about money. Maybe it was about who you were as a person, how you treated others, regardless of how much you had in your bank account. As they sat down on an old bench in the shop, the mechanic got back to work, and Alex took a deep breath before turning back to Sarah. She watched him closely, still trying to make sense of everything he had said and done so far. "I don't want you to worry about the scratch," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was kind but firm. "I'll take care of it." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "But if you really want to make up for it, there's one thing I ask of you." Sarah looked at him, surprised. What could he possibly ask for that would make her feel like she was making things right? She had already messed up. She had already put herself in a position where she felt hopeless. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tentative. Alex leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed as he regarded her with a look that was almost fatherly, as if he had seen the burden she was carrying and understood it. "Focus on your dreams," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Work hard. Keep your head down, and one day you'll be in a position where you can pay it forward to someone else who needs help." Sarah blinked, a mixture of confusion and inspiration swirling inside her. "Pay it forward," she echoed. "But I don't have anything to give. I barely have enough to take care of myself." Alex smiled gently, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Everyone has something to give, Sarah. It's not about money or material things. It's about using what you have to help others, just like I'm trying to help you. You have your time, your kindness, your ability to work hard. That's worth something, so don't give up. Don't let your circumstances define you. Focus on your dreams, and when you get to where you want to be, you'll have the power to change someone's life too." The words hung in the air, settling into her chest like a weight that was somehow both heavy and light at the same time. It felt like a challenge, a promise, and an encouragement all at once. It was the first time in a long while that someone had told her that she could do something, could be something. Sarah didn't know if she was capable of living up to Alex's words. The road ahead still seemed long and uncertain, but for the first time she could see a glimmer of hope, a path forward. She could feel the weight of her dreams stirring inside her, almost as if they were waking up from a long, deep slumber. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't know how to express everything she was feeling, but those two words seemed to encompass it all. Alex nodded, his expression softening into a genuine smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll do something with this. Focus on your future, on what you can give to the world." And as Sarah sat there, listening to the sound of the mechanic's tools working in the background, she couldn't help but feel that something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time it didn't feel as impossible as it once had. Weeks passed, and Sarah couldn't forget about the encounter. She kept her part-time job, but something inside her had changed. She was more determined than ever to chase her dreams and make something of herself, not just for her, but for others. She began saving every penny she could and even enrolled in night classes to finish her education. One afternoon, while walking to work, she saw Alex again, this time at a charity event for underprivileged youth. He was volunteering, helping kids who were struggling just like she had been. She couldn't believe it. This man, who could have easily looked down on her, was helping others without expecting anything in return. He caught her eye across the room and waved. Sarah smiled, walking over to him. "Thank you," she said softly. "You really changed my life." Alex smiled back, his eyes filled with understanding. "I didn't change anything," he replied. "You did it all on your own. Just never forget, kindness, not money, is what makes the world better."